For the next half an hour, I'm going to be talking about kind of benefiting from the change within the finance function, creating or growing a mat. So there's a number of things I'm talking about. One is structural and one is around other benefits that can be achieved. But it's really about capitalising on it. If you're becoming a mat or if you're growing a mat, what are the opportunities within the finance function to actually start making some of those changes and actually benefiting from some of the reasons you became a multi-academy trust. A bit about us and why I'm talking to you about multi-academy trust. So I head up education at PS Financials. We provide business solutions to over 45% of all of the academies and 70% of all of the large multi-academy trusts. So we've been working in the education sector for nearly 10 years. And we actually got into the sector on the back of school groups, so the early phase one sponsored academies. And over the 10 years, the sector's changed quite a lot. One thing I think in education you guys can guarantee is that there's just continual change. So we're going to talk about some of the things that we're seeing within MATs and how some of those things work, some of those things don't work, and just so you can learn from, ideally, the mistakes of others. In terms of the who's who uses us, all of those organisations use PS Financials, and the majority of them have done for well over 5 years. So this is a space that we do a lot of work in. So that's the credentials. That's hopefully why I should be saying something that's broadly in line with what you might hope to hear. And secondly, why bother? Why bother capitalising on opportunities within the finance function when growing as a multi-academy trust? So there is sliders up there, not just so I can put up that little guy. I do like these little guys walking around. But why bother? You know, I think broadly, whilst there's been a bit of a lull in activity at the moment and there's lots of kind of messages going around, broadly the messaging coming out from ministers is still that, you know, academisation and multi-academy trusts are the vehicle to achieve full academisation by, I can't see it being 21, 22, but there is still very much the view that fully academised sector and the way to get there are through multi-academy trusts. The last National Schools Commissioner, Frank Green, his view, which has broadly been shared, you know, I have dug down and asked EFE representatives and DFE around this view, but you know, 1,020 school mats is broadly the vision for the sector, assuming we can get to a fully academised sector. There are obviously maps already with 66 schools and 50 schools, but as an average, you know, what might the sector look like? There seems to be generally shared opinion that 1,020 school mats is kind of what the sector might look like come 21, 22. And a school mat, so you know, it's broadly 20 school mats. That obviously varies. If you've got 100 pupils or 2,500 pupils, what that mat might look like, even at 20 schools, can be wildly different. So it's a wild estimate that I think is a bit of sense, but you know, not a scientific estimate. With growth, you know, any inefficiencies or any challenges that you have today, if you're going to grow, those challenges will multiply. You know, there's only one way. Things are going to get harder, quicker. So anything that you can do to start capitalising on some of these opportunities now, or when you do have opportunity to change, will certainly pay back and be good down the line. And similar to that point, so much easier to address sooner, and you'll get the benefits sooner, and then you'll be in a happy place in the not too distant future. This is there's a think tank called Reform that did a paper on Academy Chains Unlocked. It's well worth a read. You know, if you're as boring as me and you like that sort of stuff. Academy Chains Unlocked. It sounds a bit like an action movie rather than a kind of a thought piece. But they've kind of done a diagram on the development of academy trusts, and they're saying that black line in the middle is the challenge line. So you can see that from 1 to 5 schools, is anybody in 1 to 5 school mat at the moment? Okay, according to this model, it's an absolute holiday. All right. These models have a place, okay, in terms of identifying exactly where you are is a challenge. But equally, you know, if you're at 6 schools and you're on that journey to grow to 10 schools, you know, it shows where times do get really tough, and that does probably coincide with our experiences. You know, 1 to 5 schools is by no means easy, but relatively easy compared to that stage where you go from 5 to 10 schools, because that's where structures start to evolve. When you're moving away from kind of an executive head teacher model, you know, other layers of structure and management goes in place. So that is a challenging time. So if you're anywhere on this map, you know, if you're in that 1 to 5 and you're looking to capitalise on some opportunities, now's the time to do that. And when you get to 10 schools, it gets easier until 19. So that model also roughly correlates with Frank Green's point around 1,020 school mats. So, we're going to start off with some structures and operating models around finance teams. So I'm going to start off with what models have we seen, and I'm going to talk about 3 defined models, okay, A, B and C. The reality is there are 3,000 models out there, and I'm going to talk about the 3 areas, but there's no right answer. If you're hoping for a bit of a blueprint to an academy operating model, I can't give you that, but hopefully talking through the kind of the broad models that we see will give you the ability to take something away on that. And the ones that we've seen are traditional, and this is still used by the vast majority of the sector. Probably 60 to 70% still have a traditional operating model, which is the school does everything at school level. So they have their own bank account, their own finance systems, they do their own bank recs, they do their own payment runs. They're doing a lot of that themselves. We've then got a hub and a cluster model, which is where we start seeing groupings, and that can lead on a regional basis. It can be based on governance structures, it can be on phases, Ofsted categories, but it's kind of a hybrid between fully autonomous school-led and the last one, which is centralized. That's the 3 models I'm going to talk about, but the reality is everybody is somewhere in the middle of that picture. Everyone at the moment is somewhere in between. Nobody is out there. There's not a mat out there that's fully centralized, and there's probably mats out there that's fully traditional. But starting from there, everybody's at a different phase. So, pictures. Let's do some nice pictures. Okay, I've done the mat. That is the mat. It's a temporary classroom. That used to be the shard. Okay, I used to say, well, the mat is in the shard. I've now downgraded that to a temporary classroom. And that might be a car. If some of you are the mat in your organisation, sometimes the CFO, BM is the mat. But for illustration purposes, we're going for a temporary classroom, okay, which is about middle ground on mat accommodation. But it doesn't have any more meaning other than it's a picture of a classroom. Then looking at schools, so traditional structure and the vast majority, and I kind of alluded to it previously, but this is, nothing really changes. So a load of schools come together in a multi-academy trust, but for finance operating purposes, schools pretty much carry on as they always have done with their own bank account, their own system, they do their own payment runs, payroll, they do everything at school level. The MAT, which could be one of you guys, then takes on kind of statutory responsibilities, whether that's VAT, audit, EFA returns, or the joy that EFA returns are. So that's out there, 60% of the sector is in that model. There's a reason that it's the majority. Firstly, it's fairly easy to implement because you can carry on as you were doing before. So when there's that whole conversion project going on, there's plenty to do, and actually something that you can get to at a later date is quite appealing. So a big reason why this hasn't been changed or looked at is because it's easy to do. It helps with the political and the school angle around schools having control and autonomy around their processes. But some of the challenges are, for some schools, they've never actually done the checkbook function themselves. Some schools have not previously been checkbook schools, and the local authority have done all the payments and the receipts. So for those schools, this is a whole world of new tasks that actually they know how to do previously. And then the challenges are around kind of duplication, and there's a lot of processes being performed multiple times within a trust. So that's there, 60–70%. Middle ground, kind of hub/cluster, it's got lots of different names, but there's a middle layer of processing, and this is generally at the lower level in the form of a kind of cluster business manager or regional finance lead or something of that ilk, rather than a temporary classroom at hub level. We've got a car at hub level, okay? So in terms of the amount of infrastructure involved, a hub would typically be, at the smaller end, a regional business manager or a regional FD. We have seen much more substantial hub settings where actually, because of geographical spread across 40 schools, we've got a north, a south and a west region. Then they have probably governance structures that align to those regions, in which case the hub is generally a bit more substantial. But in most cases we see it's kind of a shared role that takes on an element of the processing. So school, there's a common perception that within operating models are moving from kind of autonomy or traditional models through to centralization or hubs, that schools, we just get rid of people in schools. We don't need anybody in schools. We'll do it all centrally. It's just not the reality. You still have to initiate transactions in schools, and albeit we can reduce some of the processes that's happening in schools, you're not going to know at trust level, unless you've got a toilet paper monitoring system, if somebody's going to run out of toilet paper and they need to order some, or you're not going to know that somebody's broken a window. So you need that on the ground knowledge to initiate some of these transactions. So whether that's a purchase order or a purchase request, you're not going to remove that from the school. They still need to be, we need this, we need to repay this. You've still got petty cash and charge cards for that local ability to make payments, and petty cash and charge cards covers a whole host of things. But one thing, you're not getting rid of the school. There's still finance processing in the school, albeit limited, but important. What we then move to the hub level, and it's nice to see these slides have slightly merged my words. Hub responsibilities then are more on the financial processing. So that is around a bank account, and we could then start to see one shared bank account across a hub of schools. Then they can do payment runs for those schools, bank reconciliations. Can't really do VAT at hub level because VAT is still a trust submission to HMRC. You can just start to see how there's a layer between school and trust in the middle, and that, when we're looking at the whole journey, and there's generally an exception that people are moving from traditional structures to centralised structures, that seems to be generally accepted now on back office functions. It's a nice middle ground, and it's a nice step to get to, either on the journey or because of the context of your schools or your trust. You might never get to centralised because of the scenario or situation specific to your MAT. In terms of the pros and cons, where we've seen this work really, really well is where trusts have grown by taking on a little local hub of schools that have got a track record of working together. They've got that history, they're used to working together, so taking on 3 schools that have always worked together, that works really, really nicely. It does mean that you can start to reduce the interactions transactionally from trust to school. So if you're a 10-school trust, you're at the trust, or you are the MAT, you've got to deal with 10 schools if you have questions or queries. Within a hub model, that might change to 3. So at the trust, you can have your lines of authority and delegation to 3 hub managers, and then they deal with the schools, but you're just starting to put in layers of accountability that can help with that processing. Where we've seen challenges, and where we've seen it go horrendously wrong, and horrendously is the word, where you get a rogue hub. Okay, so you get 15 schools, 3 5-school hubs, and you get a hub that goes rogue. And as a hub, a 5-school voice is quite a loud voice, and rightfully so. It's a third of the overall trust. But where differences start to kind of escalate between individual hubs, so actually they start competing and challenging with each other, and equally where communication channels are not there from the overall trust, it can actually be a really difficult one to manage because hubs are much more powerful essentially than individual schools. It can all be handled with it being effectively managed and that process and kind of authorities and duties being sensibly laid out, but just one to watch. If it's not delivered properly or planned properly, it can be a real difficult relationship, that hub versus trust piece. So then moving on to centralised finance function, I just want to start off with a few points. Centralised automatically brings up resistance around kind of politics, autonomy, and kind of that fear. Centralisation, it brings up lots of fears. Okay, so I just want to do some clarifications around what centralised finance function might actually mean in a MAT environment. And I say might because there are no, it always applies. In most cases, centralised finance function is a description of the function rather than a location. This doesn't mean that you should all take out leases on Riverside apartments, okay, Riverside office complexes, and take all of the accountants and put them into a big flash building. It's happened, okay, don't get me wrong, but in reality, certainly at the smaller end when you're 5, 6, 7 schools, you can centralise a function without moving anybody. With cloud software now, you can have somebody in school A do the bank rec, somebody in school B do the purchase ledger runs, school C is the sales ledger. Centralisation means you're centralising the function and the process, not necessarily the people. So it's an important one to get out there. It does mean that sometimes, but not all the time, and actually in many smaller cases, it's been centralised without moving people or creating any more temporary classrooms or any of that. That said, those of you that work in a school finance office and have a hatch, it can be quite detrimental to your ability to get work done, particularly at break times and lunch times. So if you can remove kind of core finance from that school environment, not necessarily remove it from the school, but that hatch that people hang in, oh, can you sort out my dinner money, all of those queries. If you can segregate school finance from MAT finance, that can be particularly helpful. And lastly, big myth around centralised, let's get a load of accountants in, okay? We just haven't seen it. All the centralised trusts that we've seen, there might be an accountant hired or some recruitment, but the vast majority of roles within any centralised structure is sourced from staff within the trust. And that, if there are 10 business managers and some of those really like finance, some of those really like HR, some of those really like premises, there's plenty of opportunity for progression within a centralised MAT for individual people. If you've got specialisms, if you've got expertise in some of these areas, it's just not as simple as we're going to centralise, get rid of everybody locally and employ a load of accountants. We just don't see it happening. And lastly, I think centralised finance function, we found within our trust that it's been the first thing to change. And that has been a really good sounding board, because if finance have said, look, we're maximising the opportunities given to us as a multi-academy trust, it makes life easier when they're then, certainly around budget times and doing that strategic budget piece, look, we've done what we can, now we need to look at doing what we've done in some other areas. So that's some overall things, but what does it actually look like? Okay, broadly, that lines up lovely. What that will say is school is still doing transaction initiation. That school piece doesn't change. Purchase orders, purchase requisitions, petty cash charge cards, dinner monies, trips, breakfast clubs, after school clubs, all of that stuff, you're never going to take that away from the school. If little Johnny comes up to the hatch, a problem with Johnny's dinner money, and you say, okay, Johnny, can you please speak to the central dinner money department? You can imagine how successful that might be. You need people in schools to deal with these processes. Technology, as much as we sell technology, is not going to eliminate that. Pros and cons, okay, there's some obvious pros. You're eliminating a lot of duplication. There are efficiency savings to be made around doing things once. It doesn't take 10 times longer to do a payment run across 10 schools as it does for one. It allows benchmarking, okay, benchmarking externally. I think whilst DFE data is getting a bit better, it's still a pretty challenging space out there for you guys to really sensibly benchmark some of your fields. By centralising and ensuring consistency across your trust, internal benchmarking is a really useful process, because not only does it give you an idea of where you are in that spend piece or income piece, you can also ask questions. You can also understand why you are where you are. With any external benchmarking tool, you can potentially understand what quartile you might be in, but it doesn't really help you get better because you don't understand how other people are in different quartiles. The internal benchmarking is really good. Some of the downsides and some of the reasons why this isn't, it's still probably 20–30% of trusts are now at this stage. We've sensed a real shift over the last 12 months. The last 2 years it started. The last 12 months, this kind of centralisation is really taking hold. Politically, it can be a challenge. Academisation, big bag multi-academy trusts, that narrative is out there, and that is a barrier to centralisation. I'm going to hopefully show you how we can change some of those, but it is a barrier. It still relies on schools doing their bit, which is fairly standard, but the biggest area this has fallen down is where the process is not planned or implemented well. Centralising can happen, but it doesn't happen overnight. And we've had trusts that have essentially closed bank accounts and kept one open. We're centralising without much more thought than that. And you can imagine the impact or the end result of a process. It's doable. There are some big benefits, but it is a big process, and you've really got to think of every single financial touch point within your organisation and think how that would work if you don't have the ability to do things locally. So the reason, building on the political bits, there are some fairly standard objections that people get talking about centralisation within schools, and how our trusts have got around those. Over the past 12 months, I think the general perception is changing that there is some kind of generally agreed principles that standardising or centralising back office functions can make some sense. There's still plenty of reservations about that, but the main ones I'm going to try and cover. So the first one is around single bank account, and this is the biggest driver for efficiency in a multi-academy trust. So don't do it overnight, but if there's one thing you can do to really change the way you guys operate, is try and move to a single balance sheet, a bank account. The reason that can be a challenge is, in many cases, single bank account means the MAT is taking my cash reserves, okay? Cash doesn't equal reserves, okay? Single bank account is not the thing to worry about if you're worried about the MAT taking your reserves. You still need to worry about that, and that's absolutely a thing, but the single bank account has no link to whether the MAT wants to take your reserves. They might want to do that, but they can do that whether you've got one bank account or you've got your own bank account each. The two things just aren't linked. It is a challenge, and that is a completely different presentation, but that isn't a barrier to a single bank account. Secondly, centralization of financial processing. So this is things like doing payment runs, so centralizing payment runs and things. So challenge, less of an issue these days, but I became an academy to increase our school's autonomy. I should be able to pay who I want when I want. All right, fairly standard one. Kind of the response to that is, signing the check is not the autonomy, which is the perceived autonomy. Signing the check is the autonomy. In reality, choosing what you want to buy from who is the autonomy. Getting that paid is just a process. It's a sausage machine. The trust does that bit. That bit is not the autonomy. The autonomy is choosing what you want to buy from who. Lastly, about the payment runs, no money leaves this school without our head teacher say so. Pretty valid point. There is a link back to centralising reserves, which I'm not going to cover, but on the pure, no money leaves my school without my say so. The reality is, you don't need to sign the invoice, which is kind of the check at the moment. So if the process has been followed properly, let's think about the process. The local governors have agreed a budget, so a budget you can spend on various areas. Before a purchase is made, in theory, I say in theory loosely, there should be a purchase order or a requisition. That's the theory. That purchase or requisition is authorised. So we've defined how much we can spend in area. We've authorised the order. Somebody's then gone in and said that these goods or services have been satisfactorily received. And then if the invoice matches what's been delivered and received and matches the price and the quantity that was ordered, there's no need for further authorisation on that invoice. There's no need to authorise the payment. There's no need to authorise the invoice, because by default, it's authorised. It matches. Okay, if it doesn't match, then there's an authorisation process required. But by authorising the original budget and by authorising the purchase order, the head teachers or locally have got full control over the spend process. The payment, if the invoice comes in and matches those, you can't really not pay it. If it's been unsatisfactorily received, then you can raise a dispute, but you really don't need to sign the check in order to gain that control around spend within the schools. So that's some of the ways that people have tried to address some of those challenges head on. And that is broadly what I wanted to get to around centralisation. All right, well, thank you very much for listening.